Now to introduce our presenter for tonight's lecture, Austin Martin. Austin Martin is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Urban Studies at Temple University, where he is teaching and working on his dissertation. His research focuses on urban political ecology, urban bee biodiversity, and how the urban political economy impacts environmental justice, sustainability, and urban ecological processes. Austin received a Bachelor of Science from Eastern University with a focus on biology, sociology, and tropical ecology research experience, and a Master's of Science from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, with a focus on conservation ecology and environmental justice. Prior to attending graduate school, Austin worked as a state apiary inspector for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So at this point, I will invite Austin to join us here on Zoom, and he will get us started.
Hi, everybody, and thanks, Amy, for both introducing me just now and also for inviting me here. I'm really glad to be here and glad to talk about my research with everybody. And so as you're following along, if you have any questions, I'm excited for you to pose those questions and hopefully I'll be able to address them. And I also want to make sure that if you don't get a chance to pose a question or you feel like maybe you think of something later that you want to reach out and talk about them, I want to make myself available. And so I'll offer my email. It's going to be in my slides. Yeah, I encourage people to reach out and be in touch with me if something in this talk really interests you. So I'm going to go ahead and get my slides up here and then go ahead and share my screen. So yeah, like Amy said, I'm a PhD candidate at Temple University, specifically in the Department of Geography and Urban Studies. And I also, before doing this, I did my master's at the University of Michigan, focusing on conservation ecology, environmental justice, and my research was on urban bees in particular. And I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to go a bit into depth about that research I did. And also, again, right here's my email, aumartin@temple.edu. So yeah, today I'm talking about city-dwelling bees, urban ecology, and urban theory. And yeah, so what I do as a geographer, especially a geographer with an ecology background, is a real mismatch of things. And what I'm trying to do is look at urban bees in a way that hasn't been traditionally looked at in some of the research communities so far. You've got the urban ecology research community out there that looks at urban bees using ecological frameworks and methods. What I'm doing is trying to do that, but from the geography standpoint and specifically from the urban political ecologist standpoint. And so I'm doing things, I'm mixing up some disciplines here that haven't been mixed up before. And I think that's really important. I want to see more of these disciplines talking to each other as we experience more ecological problems. I think that kind of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research is really important. And so I'm just doing what I can. And that's in particular why I really want to get my thoughts out there and get people's thoughts, because those of you that might be coming from different maybe research disciplines or whatever kind of line of work you're in or whatever experience you have, even if you have nothing to do with academia, whatever experience you might have, I'd like to hear from people if you have thoughts that you think might be good to add. And like Amy mentioned, I was a state apiary inspector for some time. This was about 10 years ago in the early 2010s. And so this was a really cool job. With this job, the state basically just gave me a pickup truck and a gas card. And I was just going around meeting different beekeepers every day and opening up their hives and making sure that these hives were, just trying to stop the spread of potentially contagious bee pathogens and bee diseases. Right here, this is a picture of me doing a sugar shake on some people's beehives, probably somewhere in the suburbs of Philadelphia. That's one way of testing for varroa mites in beehives. And this picture on the right here, a friend of mine, Win Geary, took this picture, but it just shows that one cool example of an urban apiary, right, in this case, right in the heart of Philadelphia. You can see City Hall right there. But with this job, I was going all across the landscape of southeastern Pennsylvania. So that included Philadelphia, that included the suburbs. Whoops, excuse me, sorry, my cat is lying on my mouse right now. I'm changing my slides. This is Kimchi. Let's change back here. So going across the landscape, that included Philadelphia, that included the suburban counties, and that also included some more agrarian and remote areas in like Berks County and Lehigh County sometimes. And so I was able to see this real diversity of landscapes, and I was able to see these patterns of honeybee health emerging across this variegated landscape from the middle of a big city to the more agrarian hinterlands of Philadelphia. And that's really what got my brain jogged with some new research questions. And so, this job was really cool. But of course, I did have to hold my breath every season to see whether the state would provide enough funding for the position. And so I decided to move on to grad school, which turns out that's just as precarious as what apiary inspecting was. But it's cool. I really do enjoy what I'm doing, and I feel very engaged. And I'm bringing the research questions that first occurred to me while I was out working this job, and I'm trying to apply these in my research in grad school now. Yeah, here's just a map, an overview of like the kind of the area that I covered, just to show the diversity of the landscape, right? And depending on the season, I would cover maybe just 4 counties. Sometimes, actually, no, it kind of ranged from, I think, 6 to 9 counties. But oftentimes it was these core counties: Philadelphia, Delaware, Chester, Montgomery, Berks, Bucks, right? So again, a very diverse landscape. And at the time I was living in South Philadelphia, I was keeping beehives right on my rooftop in South Philadelphia, which is, I think, probably the most dense neighborhood of Philadelphia. Also, very few trees, very few green spaces comparatively. Yet, anyhow, my bees were still thriving. This apiary was the most thriving apiary that I had, especially in comparison, surprisingly, to apiaries that I've kept in places like Lancaster County, where I grew up, or in Delaware County, where I went to college. And so this was another thing that just jogged some of these research questions. Why is it that in this very core, dense part of the city, my bees were doing so well? Yeah, so again, right here is where South Philadelphia is. I hope you can see my cursor moving here. Right here is where South Philadelphia is very dense. You can see just the impervious surface from this satellite image here. So I had my apiary here. I had another apiary here out at Eastern University's campus on the main line. So this was less sort of covered by impervious surfaces, but lots of lawns, and those hives I had a harder time with. And then further out off the map here in Lancaster County, I also had a harder time with those hives in that agrarian landscape. So my research questions that I've taken into grad school are, well, overall, do human social demographics affect bee health, right? I was thinking about what it is about these different like landscapes and the densities of humans on these landscapes, and the human demographics of those different densities that might be affecting bee health. And if so, by what mechanism? What really is going on there, right? I want to really pick that apart. So I'm going to talk about how I've been exploring my research questions since I've been in grad school for all these years. And I'm going to cover just kind of an overview of bee decline in general, because this is something the public imagination has been fixated on, and it's important to cover as an introductory. I'm also going to cover the difference between honeybees and native bees. Native bees are also really important. I kind of use native bees and wild bees interchangeably in this talk, because honeybees did not evolve here in North America, and I'm going to get into that. I'm also going to cover how cities are havens for bees, right? That's counterintuitive. And I saw it just anecdotally with my own hives, but there is a lot of research showing this to be the case broadly. And I'm also going to talk about lawns and the political ecology of lawn care. And then I'm going to get into my own research, my own data and research and the geography of native bee richness. So first, bee decline and overview. I want to show you this convoluted chart here. It looks like there's a lot going on here, but I want to focus mostly just on, I want to just focus on the top left here, these four circles in the top left and with these arrows: poor nutrition, toxins, cold snap, and parasites, right? These are the four causal factors that feed into these subsequent positive feedback loops that ultimately result in colony collapse, or the death of a colony, right? This is a chart that a bee scientist named Randy Oliver put together, and he mostly just focuses on honeybees. And I also just want to say, when I say the phrase positive feedback loop, right, I'm not talking about something that's good, right? A positive feedback loop, right? Like there's just it's like a sort of process that has these inbuilt factors that feed into it and make it cascade even further. Another example of a positive feedback loop resulting in something bad would be like albedo disappearing. In the case of like climate change, with the atmosphere gradually warming over time, and that results in ice coverage decreasing, which means less reflection of sunlight back into space, more absorption of that sunlight, and therefore even more atmospheric heat building up, right? So a bad positive feedback loop. That's what we have here, a bad positive feedback loop. Yeah, I want to focus on just the causal factors here. I want to zero in on these things. And when we're talking about parasites, this is one of the really big parasites that it's not actually big. This picture is big, but these are tiny little parasites. These are they're known as varroa mites. And any of you, if any of you are beekeepers, or if you have any experience with beekeeping, you've heard of these things. When I was inspecting, this was the most ubiquitous problem that I was seeing across the board. Anywhere I was going, if I was meeting new beekeepers, I would ask them about how they were dealing with varroa mites, because these things, if you don't deal with varroa mites as a beekeeper, they are going to become a big problem, and oftentimes if you ignore them, they're going to lead to the death of your colonies. They're ugly looking, and they cling to the backs of bees. If a bee were the size of a person, a varroa mite would be about the size of like a frisbee. So it's kind of like having a frisbee clinging to your back and sucking your blood and spreading viruses. It's not good. And here's a picture of a pupa, a developing bee, not quite in the adult stage. It's in the pupal stage, which is analogous for, as if, if a butterfly were going through metamorphosis, this would be the cocoon stage of the butterfly. And these varroa mites, they get into the cells of these bees, of the developing pupa. That's where the mites reproduce. And then when the bee hatches as an adult, the mites also hatch with the bee, and then they cling to the adult bees, and then they just spread from bee to bee, from hive to hive, and they spread viruses, and it's just bad news. Here's another picture of an adult bee with a varroa mite clinging to the thorax of that adult bee right there. You can see just, they're just, yeah. I've had bad experiences with these things. You can hear it just in the way I'm talking about it. Another problem, and this is actually the main justification for the state apiary inspection program in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, is American foul brood. And American foul brood is actually far less common and just way more rare than varroa mites. Varroa mites are everywhere. Essentially, anytime you're keeping beehives, you're going to be dealing with varroa mites, but you're not going to be dealing with American foul brood a lot of the time. But when you are dealing with it, it's such a big problem that you, well, historically the advice has been to just burn your hives, but more recently there have been new methods introduced to deal with this that involve shaking out all of your bees into completely new equipment and forcing them to start over entirely, so that when they process that new wax in their new colony, that processing of that wax has them basically processing that bacteria, the American foul brood bacteria, through their bodies, getting rid of it. But yeah, this, like I said, this is a bacterial problem. It's not a viral problem that gets, like, such as those that get introduced with varroa mites. But this bacteria, it has two stages. It's got the vegetative stage and the spore stage. And the spore stage is just so contagious that those spores get all over all of your beekeeping equipment, all over the wax of the beehive. And so those spores can stick around for the better part of a century, for 70, 80 years, maybe more. And so any used beekeeping equipment that has had this problem in the past is going to perpetuate this problem. And so apiary inspectors are really looking out for this, just making sure that this stays as rare as it is. It's a good thing that it's rare. But this picture here just shows a dead bee larva. It's kind of rotted into this goopy mass. And when you poke it with a toothpick, like you see in this picture, and then you draw that toothpick away slowly, that characteristic ropiness is a kind of a dead giveaway right there of American foul brood. You can also do other tests and see whether you have it or not, but this is just another common pathogen and parasite that common thing in the pathogen parasite category that beekeepers need to deal with. So we've covered just a quick overview of parasites. I want to get into toxins and poor nutrition in particular. These are big things, especially when we're talking about like landscape characteristics, which I've gotten into as a geographer. So toxins. Now this picture is of an entrance of a Langstroth hive. And you can see this pile of dead honeybees right out front. And that pile of dead honeybees is, when you see a big pile like that, it's characteristic of a potential toxin kill, right? These bees might have gotten too close to some kind of pesticide nearby that has caused this. And also in the nutrition, in the lack of nutrition category, lack of forage is also a big problem, and this is also linked to landscape dynamics. This is a picture I took next to my grandmother's house in Lancaster County, and it looks green, it looks nice. It's a beautiful agrarian landscape, but from the perspective of a bee or a pollinator, this is a food desert. There's nothing going on here. There's just one type of plant as far as you can see. It's a monoculture, and so there's not a diversity of forage that these bees can collect from, and so that's another problem as well. So together, toxins and lack of forage, these are characteristic of agrarian landscapes, and these are two of the main factors that Randy Oliver identifies in that cascading loop, as initial causes in that cascading loop that lead to colony death. But it's not just agrarian landscapes; it's suburban landscapes and urban landscapes too. This, this common lawn picture that we see here, common to North America, the United States in particular, but Canada is also a big offender. This is also just from the pollinator and bee perspective, just as bad as the agrarian landscape, as the corn monoculture or the soybean monoculture. So anyway, that's an overview of bee decline. I want to also get into the difference between honeybees and native North American bees, and there is a lot of biodiversity out there. So with honeybees, scientific name Apis mellifera, this is a species that's very key for the way we practice agriculture. Our food system and the way that it has become industrialized in the form of industrialized monocultures completely relies on the honeybee in particular to prop it up, to pollinate all of these multi-billion-dollar monocultural industries that we've got across the United States. And in order for honeybees to be able to support these large monocultures that require that pollination, they are trucked in industrial fashion across the landscape to get to whatever is blooming at any particular time of year. The biggest of all of these industries is the almond industry in California, Central California, in the Central Valley. But we've got other, this image here just shows the other really huge monocultural industrial industries that we've got in different regions across the country. So a beekeeper might be, a large industrial beekeeper might be based in Pennsylvania or Florida, but depending on whatever time of year it is, they're going to be in California or Washington. And a large part of their income, most of their income is coming from pollination leases. not necessarily from the honey that they might be selling on the side. If they are selling honey, that's just the side thing. The bulk is coming from these leases from these large industries. And they put these Langstroth hives on these flatbed trucks to truck them across the country. You might have heard about the occasional truck crash that happens on a highway, in which they have to call in local beekeepers to wrangle the mess, with all of these upset honeybees flying around. But yeah, this is common practice. And the reason the honeybee, as opposed to any other bee species, is the key one that needs to be used for this endeavor is because the honeybee is the only species that lives in these large colonies, anywhere from 20,000 to 100,000 plus individuals per colony. And they can be kept in these Langstroth hives. The Langstroth hive was invented in the, I believe it was the 18th century, actually here in Philadelphia, by a man by the last name of Langstroth, urban beekeeper right here in Philadelphia. But yeah, I mean, it's just that with the Langstroth hive, it's a nice box, easy to organize. You can stick it right on that flatbed truck and it can be driven anywhere. There's no other bee species that could be managed in that way. So, bumblebees are used for commercial purposes at a smaller scale in greenhouses sometimes. But it's really the honeybee that is the pedestal for upholding the pollination needs of this food system as we know it today. And here's a picture of me with my own honeybees. I continue to keep honeybees and I love it. It's the only bee species that you can connect with in this particular way, where you're, looking at the frames, managing the brood, checking for parasites, looking after the queen, making sure all the dynamics are good. You can have maybe a bee hotel with native bees and providing space for native bees to nest, but it just doesn't quite provide that same connection. So there are, of course, there are ecological problems with the honeybee. Ecologists do point out that honeybees often outcompete other bee species in the landscape when they're pollinating, especially when that landscape has a low diversity of forage. High diversity ecosystems don't really have that problem as much. And so one more reason why we need, to move towards more diverse landscapes, more diverse ecosystems. But I think it's just I maintain beekeeping is valuable mostly for the connection that it allows people. It allows people to grow that connection, that personal connection with these insects. And I often see people starting beekeeping and then from there becoming really familiar with what is blooming when and where in their own local landscape. So people become naturalists oftentimes because of beekeeping. And I really like to see that. I think beekeepers associations can play a really big role in both facilitating that connection between people and their landscape, and also maybe trying to, at a certain level on a regional scale, manage. Now, this is something I haven't seen done, but I would like to maybe see in the future, beekeepers associations managing, the density of honeybees and looking out for cases when honeybee colonies might be too dense and outcompeting other bee species. But you can see in this picture I took just the other week in one of my own colonies here. You can see it. There's a virgin queen right here. She just hatched out of one of these queen cells, and she's getting ready to go and mate and then lay eggs after that for the rest of her life. So very cool, just a very cool experience to have, just beekeeping in general. And here's a picture. I just visited my friend in Michigan, who I used to run the University of Michigan Beekeeping Club with, and this is his very nice apiary with these eastern red cedars blooming right behind his apiary. Just really beautiful. I thought I would share this picture. But honeybees get a lot of attention. They get too much attention, I would argue. And a lot of the funding, a lot of the federal funding goes to honeybees, but we need to be thinking about these many other bee species, and we need to be thinking about the overall diversity of bees. In particular, we've got about 20,000 bee species worldwide, and here in North America, we have about 2,000 of those species. In Pennsylvania and Michigan, each there are about 400 species, and most of these species globally don't live like the honeybee. They live solitary lifestyles. They nest in the soil. They nest in hollow stems, which is why putting out a bee hotel is what they look for. They look for those just hollow spaces, maybe holes in bricks that they can nest in. And they've got all kinds of different sizes and shapes and colors. You can see these really beautiful iridescent race car blue, race car green. I love looking at this vast diversity of bees. And when we're thinking about organizations and governmental agencies funding pollinator conservation, I would like to see, and there has been a good direction towards looking at the vast array, not just at honeybees. I'd like to see more of that that attention and funding going towards the whole diversity of native and wild bees that we've got out there. And Sam Drogi, I think of him as one of the patron saints of bee research, of native bee research in particular. He's with the U.S. Geological Survey, based here in the Mid-Atlantic region. And he takes photographs of the bees that he collects, and his photography is among the best I've seen of native bees. So check him out. I think he's on social media, so look for his stuff if you want to see more of this photography. I just want to feature some of his stuff because I think it's so beautiful. Here's a carpenter bee. Here's Megalopta genalis. Look at that race car green right there on the thorax. And even more just stark race car green here in the Agochlora pura. So now that I've talked about native bees, I want to get back to a little bit of talking about bee decline. And I want to highlight this study from the University of Vermont from Cohen Ricketts. They modeled wild bee abundance across the United States based on known parameters that we have. They looked at data that we have available in certain specific regions, and they extrapolated that, modeled that across the whole US. And so this is a cool visual. It looks nice, but it's a little troubling. And because what they're showing here is the blue / purple, depending on your monitor, is showing areas where bee abundance is steady or maybe even increasing, but the yellow is decreasing. And there's a troubling amount of yellow spots we can see across the US. And I like to, when I'm teaching about this stuff, I like to ask my students what they notice about the yellow areas. What do they see? What is maybe corresponding with those yellow areas? And I'll just tell you, it's agriculture. It's industrial agriculture. Right here, we've got the Central Valley of California is a yellow splotch. This is where the almond industry is, and a bunch of other industries in industrial agriculture. We've got the bread basket here in the Midwest, just tons of corn and soybean. We've got the Mississippi River Delta right here, going from like Michigan down through the Midwestern states, through down to Louisiana, splotches across Florida and the East Coast here. It all corresponds with industrial agriculture. So what they found here between 2008 and 2013, their model showed bee abundance declined by 23% across US land area. And this was always, in general, associated with where land has been converted to agricultural land. So knowing that the agricultural landscape can be so hostile to bees, it's no surprise actually that cities can be havens for bees. Now, again, this is counterintuitive, but it makes sense when we're thinking about this context. And there's a lot of research, a growing body of scientific literature showing cases where bees actually do better in urban landscapes than in surrounding natural landscapes and surrounding agricultural landscapes. One example of that research is from Catherine Baldock. She's one of the leading researchers in urban bees. She's based in the UK. And what she found right here, I'm highlighting one of her figures. When we're talking about bee abundance, we're talking about the number of individual bees found in their sampling. And when we're talking about richness, we're talking about the number of different types found. So in both abundance and richness, urban areas in Catherine Baldock's research had significantly higher levels than in farm areas and in nature reserve areas. Very interesting. This kind of blew me away when I first saw it, but again, given the context we're talking about, it kind of does make sense. And so here's another example of another piece of that growing literature. These researchers listed here are a lot of the people that are very active in this field. And they're putting out, essays on the city as a refuge for insect pollinators. One in particular really interesting study was done by Doug Sponsler. Doug is a friend of mine, and he's also on my PhD committee at Temple. He's currently in Germany. He's based in Philly, but he's currently working on one of his postdocs in Germany. And he's done a lot of urban bee research, both with native bees and with honeybees. But with this particular study, what he and his research team did was they used honeybee colonies across the city of Philadelphia. These are the colonies that they sampled from. They sampled pollen from those colonies, and they allowed the bees to tell us what they're pollinating across the urban landscape. So they took that pollen that they collected and they ran it through the lab at Penn State where Doug was at the time. And they looked at the DNA of that pollen and parsed out what exactly those bees were pollinating from. So that's a really cool method, especially because urban research, urban botany can be it can be just methodologically difficult to really get a full sample of what's out there. So Doug and his team just let the bees tell us what's out there. A really cool way they did that. And it kind of summed up what Doug found was that Philly honeybee colony weight fluctuates throughout the spring and summer in a way that echoes non-urban areas. There's a fluctuation, the weight goes down a little bit during, there's a dearth of pollen and nectar, rather nectar in particular, in the middle of the summer. And then but then the weight goes up again towards the end of the summer when there's a new wave of nectar availability. And again, there's a third wave in the autumn. They also found that woody perennials, this includes trees, shrubs, and vines, are especially essential for urban honeybees. And that includes exotic woody vines in the summer and fall. And now the urban landscape, we all know the importance of native plants, but the urban landscape is just so amalgamated and so infused with non-natives that I don't see personally when we're talking about managing urban landscapes, I don't see much of a hope in fully achieving like a totally native landscape. And so this is a case where I'm thinking maybe, especially looking at Doug's research here, it might be good thinking about pollinators to, in certain cases, very limited cases, maybe to embrace some of the non-natives that we've got out there, especially the non-native exotic woody vines in the summer and fall, because what this research shows is that some of these in the urban landscape are very key for these honeybee colonies, and these might be part of the reason why bees are doing so well in urban landscapes. And just two examples I have on the slide in the genus Clematis and the genus Hedera, two examples of non-native woody vines that urban bees very, very highly rely on, especially in the summer and the fall. So knowing that, looking just at the urban situation with bees, I want to move into the political ecology of lawn care, because lawns are such a big part of urban and suburban landscapes. If we're not talking about agrarian landscapes and natural landscapes, we're talking about, in the case of urban and suburban, we're talking about lawns as a big driver of what those landscapes look like. Now, to do that, I want to get into some of the work of Paul Robbins. He's a leading political ecologist. And he was at Ohio State for a while, and so he was doing some research there. What we see here is just the map of the census tracts of Columbus, Ohio. Right here in the middle, where the census tracts are smaller, are where we see, that's the core of Columbus. And then as the census tracts get larger, the further out you get, those are more suburban census tracts. And so the lighter colors, the white census tracts, are census tracts where the lawn area is the smallest, and then the darker the census tract, the greater the lawn area. So it makes sense, right? The further away you get from the center of the city of Columbus, the greater lawn area we're seeing. And it's important to look at this mostly because, well, what Paul Robbins points out is that between 1960 and 1990, urban land use in Ohio grew at 4.7 times the growth rate of the state's population. So it's important to look at the population dynamics, the history of these urban landscapes. He also shows this, similar to the last figure, this is just the potential lawn ratio per census tract. We see a similar pattern. The lawn ratio towards the center of the city is lower, and then in the suburbs it's higher. And so Paul Robbins went on in his research about this, and he actually gave some personal anecdotes. He talked about his mom, who lives in suburban Reynoldsburg, Ohio, outside of the city of Columbus. I have it pinned right here. And his mom experienced a pretty wild experience, and I think it's illustrative of what we're dealing with here. She was thinking about all this lawn stuff. She decided she wanted to let her lawn grow out. She wanted to let her lawn undergo primary and secondary succession, and allow some shrubs and trees to grow in her lawn, let the grass grow a little bit. And she started experiencing the anger of her neighbors. Soon her neighbors, they were going to the city of Reynoldsburg to insist on the forcible mowing of Paul Robbins's mom's lawn. And then they, when nothing happened from that, they took her to civil court because they argued that she was lowering their property values. And then finally, they actually went so far as to start trespassing on her lawn. They started just going on her lawn and mowing her lawn themselves. They taking down the saplings and everything. It got really ugly. And I've heard a lot about this, not just with Paul Robbins's mom, but with other people that have tried to do this, especially in suburban neighborhoods. Also, especially when an HOA is involved, a homeowners association. People have a really hard time with letting their lawn kind of break the mold of what the surrounding lawn landscape looks like. And people get really angry about that. And there's all kinds of friction that comes about. So the city eventually, in this case, they did rule in favor of Miss Robbins' case, and they did not enforce the 6-inch maximum lawn height that was mandated by municipal law. But the civil case does, at least last I checked in Paul Robbins's writing, that civil case remains pending. But it just hints at some of these wider dynamics that we've got going on here. So I want to talk about the lawn. It's so central, and it's kind of just under our noses. We all experience lawns in our day-to-day lives, whether we have one or not. We all come across lawns, and lawns have a political history. There are some that argue that the reason lawns are common and the reason that people gravitate towards wanting lawns is because of human evolutionary history. Humans as a species evolved in the African savanna, and so that's kind of what humans maybe gravitate towards. But I'm personally, of course, we did evolve as a species in the African savanna, but I'm very suspicious of such a deterministic account of what we are inclined towards. Because as a species, and the way we work with our brains and our social lives, it's just our experience is so modulated by society, and so I would argue, and I agree with Paul Robbins in his account here, that rather than that evolutionary explanation, the lawn has a more just political explanation, a political history explanation. And it kind of can be, you can look back to the beginning of the control of labor in 18th and 19th century England. That was a time in sort of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, in which the control of labor was becoming a more commonplace thing. And with the control of labor, it became just a lot easier to compel people to maintain vast lawns, like what we were first seeing back in old paintings like in Hieronymus Bosch, right? And so this cultural aesthetic, this ideal, was able to be materialized and realized more commonly with the control of labor. And so we've got that European history to the lawn, and then European colonizers came to North America. And with that colonization of North America came that lawn aesthetic, the political economic conditions of that controlled labor to allow for that. And along with that, also European non-indigenous grass species. And so there was a sort of co-production, right? We often think of European colonization of North America as a, just a sort of human event, a very, like a part of human history, but there's also an ecological history here because of all of the European species that came along with European colonizers. It totally changed North American ecosystems, North American landscapes. And so scholars like Alfred Crosby and other political ecologists after him have referred to this as a co-production between humans and other non-human species. It takes the whole team of humans and non-human species to have created the North American landscapes that we currently have today. And so that brings us to the present day North American landscape. And again, I want to put these two pictures side by side, the agrarian landscape and the lawn landscape. These two landscapes just have so much in common. And Paul Robbins points out the striking parallels between these two landscapes. Now, when we're talking about lawn coverage, nationwide, lawn coverage in the United States is estimated to be between 9 and 16 million hectares. A hectare is a little smaller than an acre. I forget the conversion off the top of my head, but so think of a hectare as a similar sort of metric as an acre. But we've got between 9 and 16 million hectares of lawn coverage nationwide. And that area, that's an area that surpasses export crop coverages like barley, cotton, and rice. And lawn grasses, we can think of lawn grasses as a domesticated grass species. Grass is in the Poaceae family, the Poaceae plant family, and that's the same plant family as corn and wheat and rice, right? So grass is right in there along with all of these other, the same plant families, all these other export crops. And so with the exception of the grass species called red fescue, all turf grass species used in lawns here in North America are non-native. Again, brought over from North America during the process of colonization and afterwards too. So the lawn is not an indigenous ecosystem, and therefore it requires high inputs. It requires a lot of, to keep it looking like we see in this picture, it requires a lot of herbicides, a lot of fertilizers, a lot of irrigation, just like in some of these agrarian landscapes, which are also non-indigenous landscapes. So just these striking parallels when we think about these two landscapes side by side. And so when we're talking about chemicals, agrochemicals that include pesticides and herbicides, there's a linkage between those chemicals used in the lawn landscape and in the agrarian landscape. Now, after World War II, the war ended, and these chemical companies that were doing wartime production suddenly needed a new market because that wartime market ended for them. So they started more aggressively marketing towards agricultural use. And you can see that when we pull up some of the advertisements from that time period, you can see that crossover in just the way these advertisements were done. So that kind of marks a beginning of a lot of this heavy chemical use. And there was, the lawn as we knew it was increasing a little bit, especially with the construction of highways, which allowed people to move outside of the core of cities and commute in more so. And so we saw the construction of suburban landscapes allowing for lawns. But it wasn't until the 1980s onwards that the lawn as we know it today really became what it is. And that was sort of, that came about in part because there was a worldwide economic crash in the agricultural sector in the 80s. There was a comparatively small recession, but it really impacted the agricultural sector. And that was another sort of loss for the market of some of these chemical industries. And so they needed to expand their market further. And so from then on, they also more aggressively marketed into lawns, right? So we've got from World War II use of chemicals to post-World War II agricultural use to post-1980s lawn use is kind of a succession that we've seen in terms of these widening markets of chemical use. And a lot of these chemicals used in lawn maintenance are creating all this non-point source pollution and water quality problems 40 plus years after the Clean Water Act's passage. And of course, in more recent years, we've seen other ways that the Clean Water Act has been eroded. The Clean Water Act has been really successful over the decades, but these lawn chemicals have been one thing that's really been holding back the progress we could be seeing with the Clean Water Act. So we've got some of these commonly used lawn chemicals are 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid, and this is a systemic herbicide. It selectively kills most broadleaf weeds by causing uncontrolled growth in them, but it leaves grasses like cereals, lawn turf, and other grassland unaffected. We've got atrazine. This is an herbicide of the triazinine class, and it's used to prevent pre- and post-emergence broadleaf weeds. It's very commonly used in the US, and it's an endocrine disruptor. We've got diazinon. This is a non-systemic organophosphate insecticide. This is actually outlawed in the US in 2005, but it still is used in agricultural settings. We've got dicamba, which is a broad spectrum herbicide. We've got imidacloprid. This is a systemic insecticide. This is an insect neurotoxin. It's a type of neonicotinoid, which you might have heard of in a lot of the public discourse around some of the chemicals that are impacting pollinators. This is in particular a big hazard for bees. It impacts honeybee colonies in a sort of subtle way. Not, there's a sort of buildup as bees pollinate and pick this chemical up. And of course, it's also affecting non-honeybee species. Now, I want to point out this really interesting thing here. Paul Robbins took this survey of homeowners with lawns, and he was asking them he was asking them some of these questions, these two questions down here, whether they know that lawn care practices have a negative effect on water quality, and whether they know that companies that provide lawn care services have some effect on water quality near their neighborhood. And he found that people who said yes to those questions, people who were aware of that environmental impact of the chemicals they're using, were actually more likely to be using those chemicals. So a lot of the predictors of chemical use were the value of someone's home. The higher the value of the home, the more likely. The higher the income, the more likely. The higher the age, the more likely. The higher the education, the more likely. But also the more environmentally aware along the lines of these two questions, the more likely there was to be chemical use in the lawn, right? So there's a counterintuitive thing going on here. People who, it's not just a sort of ignorance thing. And it kind of shows that people are trapped in this system, right? They might be highly aware of what's going on, but they might be involved with the need to keep property values intact, or they might be under the thumb of HOA regulations or neighbor pressure, like Paul Robbins' mom experienced, right? So it just goes to show this, this inspirational quote here: a beautiful lawn doesn't happen by itself, right? There are all kinds of systemic factors going into this. And one of the most important, symbolically important lawns right here is just a big example of the sort of embeddedness this has in the public consciousness. But a lawn that's good for pollinators doesn't look like the National Mall, or doesn't look like that picture that we saw earlier. It looks like this, right? We've got things blooming in the spring like purple dead nettle or dandelions. This is much better for the diversity of forage that pollinators need to avoid some of those initial factors that I highlighted in Randy Oliver's positive feedback loop chart earlier on, right? So knowing all this, I want to just highlight at the end here some of my own research and my data looking at the geography of native bee richness. And as a part of my master's research, when I was at the University of Michigan, I looked at the city of Detroit, which is outlined in red here. Interestingly, Detroit has kind of a hole in the middle. It's got these two townships that kind of cut it out, Highland Park and Hamtramck, Michigan. But Detroit is a very interesting city, of course. It's post-industrial, and more so than other post-industrial cities, it's been shrinking in population. I mean, it's still very culturally vibrant. A lot of cool stuff happening in Detroit. A lot of great urban agriculture happening there, and vibrant communities. But it is a troubled city, and it is shrinking. And there are a lot of blocks that have just become abandoned and are being converted to urban prairies, essentially. And you can see this shows household income across the city of Detroit. And we can see the darker areas are areas that are lower in household income, and out in the suburbs, we've got much higher household income. And so I decided to sample bees across the spectrum of income. And this is the kind of landscape we're dealing with here in Detroit. You know, again, a lot of areas that used to be more populated, but are being converted to urban prairies. The city went from about 2 million people at its height in the mid 20th century down to, I think, just shy of 700,000 people. And so that's a huge drop. But I also sampled out in the suburbs in Macomb County, for instance, and some of the other surrounding counties, which of course follow a lot of what I've just been talking about here with the types of landscapes that are hostile to pollinators. Detroit hosts tons of urban wildlife. And I was also inspired by some of the research of my colleagues at the University of Michigan. They were looking at the cities of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti outside of Detroit. And you don't have to make sense of this entire thing, but I want to just highlight a couple of these relationships they found. They found that there's a negative relationship with income and weed coverage in a neighborhood. So the higher the income, the lower the weed coverage. And there's a positive relationship between weed coverage and bee abundance. So the higher the weed coverage, the higher the bee abundance. So by inference, we can surmise that the higher the income, the lower the bee abundance. And so that's kind of the model I was going for. I wanted to look at these different socioeconomic variables to see how they might be affecting bee diversity by way of how people are managing their landscapes, how people are managing lawns, et cetera. These are the 24 sampling sites I sampled from throughout the city. And you can see these sampling sites superimposed again on a map of median household income. And so that I've got, the whole spectrum here. And what I did when I sampled is per lawn, I outlined the lawn right here, and I put out sampling cups, these fluorescent cups. Bees see their vision is shifted more towards the ultraviolet. They don't see like as we do as humans, they don't see the more red shifted colors like the oranges and your reds and so forth. They're seeing everything from yellow onwards. So the cups, I painted them ultraviolet blue, ultraviolet white, ultraviolet yellow. And unfortunately, I did have to kill these bees, which is common practice in bee research. You get into this research because you love these insects, and then you have to kill them, and it hurts. But I mean, it's not registering on the population level. And these collections do go a long way in providing historical data. You can store these pinned collections in museums and provide data for generations in the future. So I collected these bees. Here's one of my research assistants at the time, Taylor, helping me out. Here's a picture of one of those cups on the ground. Here's a picture of me netting. So I also netted because some of the bees are a little large for those cups, and so I went out with nets. This is one of my mentors, Rebecca Tonietto, teaching me out in the field. I also collected microclimatic data with this little tool called an anemometer, just to try to control for anything like local temperature and wind variations. And then I took my samples back to the lab, and I just went through all of this time to identify the bees. It took a long time. And so a lot of the most common bees that I found were the genus Ogochloropsis, really, again, pretty sheen here to them. Seratina, pictured right here, and the genus Lasioglossum. These are very tiny bees. They almost look like flies to the untrained eye. But I found a huge diversity. Those were just the most common ones that I found. And now, actually, Amy, I would like to ask you here, 8 o'clock is our stopping time, right? I want to also maybe get to questions here, so I want to try to speed along if we need to. Our
official stop time for tonight is 8:30, and that includes questions. Yeah, so keep going.
Great. So to analyze this data, I used GIS, or Geographic Information Systems. This is a form of digital mapping that I've become proficient in as a geographer, and a tool that I've been glad to bring into my bee research. And again, another important way that these different disciplines can talk to each other, and these different mixed methods can bolster a lot of this research. So what I did with geographic information systems was at the center of this circle here is where my lawn is that I sampled from. And so I drew a 1 kilometer radius around that sampling site, which kind of represents the foraging range of your average native bee. And so within that range, all these different lines that you see are the borders of different census tracts in Detroit. And so I used GIS to agglomerate all of that data together, all of the data attached to those census tracts. And I took the weighted average, essentially. So I basically figured out the sort of average of different socioeconomic things like education, age, race, median household income within that foraging radius to account for the underlying socioeconomic variables that might be affecting the bees that I sampled in the middle of that radius. So I had a lot of fun with this. And here you can see the radii that I drew of all of my 24 sampling sites and the lines, again, of those different census tracts. And then I used R, and R is just a coding language. It's very helpful for statistical coding. Anyone out there who's dipped into statistical analysis might have found R to be really useful. It looks intimidating, and it really was intimidating when I first learned this. I felt like I don't think I've ever felt more stupid than trying to learn this coding language, but I eventually got there with a lot of hard work. And it's actually, if any of you are out there and you've tried dipping into this stuff and you're having a hard time with it, if you keep at it, it really is worth it, because this statistical analysis, these methods are really, really powerful and really useful. So I used a type of statistical model that allowed me to take all of the different potential social variables, again, age, race, median household income, all that stuff. And I also was able to throw in the local temperatures and wind variations. And I also, while I was out there sampling bees, I was also looking at the flowers and measuring the diversity of flowering plants around those sampling sites. And I included those diversity measures of the flowers in the statistical model as well. Threw all that together, and I was able to essentially find that there was a very strong positive statistical correlation between median household income and bee diversity. Now, before I talk more about that, bee diversity, I just want to reiterate, I mentioned this a little bit earlier when I was talking about Catherine Baldock's urban bee research, but bee diversity is broken into these two components, bee abundance and bee richness. Bee abundance, it just, again, it's the number of individuals that I found, and richness is the number of different types that I found. And together, those account for the overall diversity. And but in the case of both abundance and richness, I found that the higher the income, statistically, the lower the diversity. So the higher the income, the lower the abundance, and the higher the income, the lower the richness, right? So wealthier neighborhoods were basically more hostile. What I found, they were more hostile to bees overall, the numbers of bees and different types of bees I was finding, which was very interesting. That goes against what's called the luxury effect, this common sort of framework used in urban ecology, that oftentimes urban ecological researchers find higher levels of diversity of plants or whatever system of organisms they're looking at in wealthier neighborhoods. But I found the opposite of that. The wealthier neighborhoods had lower bee numbers, lower bee diversity. So because we have till 8:30, I was considering speeding through this part, but I want to get into a little bit of urban ecology and how my master's research sheds some light on urban ecological frameworks and theory here. So urban ecology, just as a field, it sits on the nexus between the social and the natural sciences. You can see the way I was using both the social and the natural sciences in my research, right? I was using census data and I was out there sampling bees. But despite this nexus, despite this sort of mixed discipline approach, urban ecology as a discipline kind of tends to shy away from employing structural understandings. It doesn't think about I've noticed that it doesn't often think about sort of structural accounts of the political economy, like maybe, for instance, how the political economy might be driving the way the landscape is being shaped, and therefore driving urban organisms and ecological conditions and ecosystems, right? Urban ecologists do a good job of looking at, and I did this too in my research. I just looked at the variables like income and education, age, race, et cetera. That's common in urban ecology to do, but I did that in my master's. But what I want to do now that I'm in this geography PhD program is take that a step further and account for the histories and structures of urban economic structures that are affecting the urban landscape. And so one way that I'm trying to do this is taking a second look at the luxury effect. Or again, the luxury effect is the idea that the higher the income, the higher the wealth in a neighborhood, the more biodiversity you're going to find there. This is the case for both vegetative studies and for animal studies. This notion, the luxury effect hypothesis, first came about back in 2003 with this paper, this Hope et al. Paper. They found, you can see this really stark positive relationship between median family income and the number of perennial plants per site that they found. So this is a pretty textbook example of the luxury effect. And since this study, there have been a lot of other cases. So we need to ask about these mechanisms. Why is the luxury effect happening? And a lot of answers that have been put out there, a lot of what urban ecologists are saying are that maybe it's because higher income households have greater purchasing power. They can do more landscaping. They have more money for landscaping. Maybe it's because people with more money can choose neighborhoods with more green spaces. That's, maybe a good explanation. Neighborhood choice, humans and other species favor environmentally desirable areas in general, right? So there's a filtering effect possibly going on in that way. But like I said, the research of mine in Detroit that I just talked about goes counter to the luxury effect. And I want to rethink what we're seeing here, right? And Kuras et al. Is another researcher who put out this, they did a meta-analysis. They just took they looked at all of the papers out there, and they found that there is a growing number of exceptions to the luxury effect. And so when we see this growing number of exceptions, including my own research in Detroit, we do need to take a step back and re-examine this. And so criticisms of this is that it frames the consumer and just this accumulation of individual consumer decisions as the main driver. It's, in that way, it's very atomistic, right? It only thinks about, just the individual consumer. In that way, it fails to take into account, again, these larger and structural economic processes that might be shaping the landscape. And that's what political ecologists are really good at, looking at, economic structures and how those are affecting processes and landscapes, et cetera. Urban ecology, it does show signs of readiness to go more in that more structural direction. There's a cool paper that came out in 2020, Shell et al., the ecological and evolutionary consequences of systemic racism in urban environments. And they found that urban neighborhoods that have historical occurrences of redlining, where there was, redlining was when real estate agencies literally just drew red lines on maps and excluded Black home buyers from being able to buy in those neighborhoods. Or actually, it was the other way around. It was neighborhoods that had a predominance of Black homeowners where they drew those red lines. And so in that way, they sort of maintained a level of segregation via real estate practices. And those neighborhoods that were redlined oftentimes had lower city resources and lower investment in green spaces, et cetera. And so that lower investment from that racist political history has an effect that continues on today. We can see that those neighborhoods have lower occurrences of tree canopy cover, like urban trees, and therefore lower diversity of as a knock-on effect of that. And so, I think this paper is going in a much better direction compared to a lot of other urban ecology papers. But the way they're still framing this, they're still kind of looking at they're framing this as if this all happened because of the biases and stereotypes of the policymakers at the time, and there definitely were biases and stereotypes that policymakers had at the time, but they're still not quite getting at, like, again, structural trends in the urban economy and how those were also maybe shaping some of these dynamics. And so I want to highlight the way political ecology takes these structural forces into account and how we might be able to get these disciplines talking to each other more, and how I'm going to be using that in my approach as I continue my dissertation. So what political ecology can offer is an understanding of political economic processes. And we've got political ecologists such as, or geographers such as David Harvey, Doreen Massey, and Neil Smith, and they look at the fact that capitalist urban political economies require there to be an uneven sort of patchwork of investment in the urban landscape, because real estate interests need that, they need disinvested neighborhoods to be able to leverage to make a profit. That's called, closing the rent gap. And once they close that rent gap, they've increased the property values in a given neighborhood that used to be disinvested. In order to continue on, they need to have more disinvested neighborhoods that they can move on to, right? So there needs to be a sort of perpetual patchwork of both disinvested and invested urban neighborhoods for that rent gap to be able to be closed. And so the uneven patchwork that we see, and you can even see that from these satellite images I included here, you can see that unevenness in the investment of urban neighborhoods from space even. That's basically essential. It's not just sort of a coincidental thing that we see in cities. It's sort of an essential way that the urban political economy works. And understanding that process in the urban political economy is going to be key in furthering our understanding of urban ecosystems and how that might be affecting, in my case, urban pollinators. David Harvey also, back in the late 70s, looked at these cyclical trends in building activity in the United States because of urban economic structure, these structural economic processes, right? And so we see that both over space and over time, we can kind of gather these patterns that are taking place and use those patterns to maybe predict what might be coming, and to predict how different political economies and these processes might be affecting our urban ecosystems. And one key concept that urban political ecology brings is also the urban growth machine. The urban growth machine was introduced by these sociologists Logan and Malich in the 70s, and they looked at how urban municipalities compete amongst each other for investment, and it's kind of a zero-sum game, right? If one municipality gets all of the tax base, the other one is going to be deprived of that tax base, right? So there's this game that neighboring municipalities are playing in order to vie for all of that investment that they need, and this became more of a commonplace after the mid-20th century. We had a case earlier in the 20th century where there was more top-down federal funding, and in that case there wasn't as much of a cutthroat sort of competition amongst municipalities, but we saw big changes, especially from Reagan onwards, of a lack of top-down federal investment in urban municipalities, right? And so they were left to their own devices with their own tax bases, and thus we've got this dynamic that these scholars describe as the urban growth machine. We also have these concepts of use value and exchange value, and these two concepts are in contradiction to one another. Use value is basically how much human use you can get from a piece of land, and when we have an example of urban agriculture, that's a piece of land in the city with high use value. And exchange value is basically what that's worth on the market. And often cases, a vacant lot that's been turned into urban agriculture, it's initially not worth much. It's got a high use value when it gets turned into agriculture, right? It brings community together. It's got the local food element. High use value but the exchange value is initially low, and then it will rise over time, especially when that plot of land becomes more attractive. Eventually, those surrounding parcels of land will rise in exchange value, rise in property value, and to the point where real estate often will eventually just build luxury condominiums over what used to be urban agriculture, because that's their chance to close that rent gap and to get that highest exchange value possible. And so in the urban political economy that we currently have, exchange value always takes precedence over use value. And because they're in contradiction with one another, we see this perpetual game of, these nice plots of urban agriculture often being only temporary because they get turned into luxury condos or whatever else it might be. There was actually a really kind of interesting but troubling case study that I read about Marcus Garvey Park in New York City. Marcus Garvey Park was a place where that was the sort of center of the Harlem Renaissance in the 20th century. And there was this community of drum circle that played there, and it was mostly Black residents. But the city of New York invested in that park. They added green space amenities to Marcus Garvey Park, which is good. We want better green spaces for everybody. But the way that exchange value and use value work together, well, when those investments came to Marcus Garvey Park, that caused the surrounding parcels of land to rise in property value. And then real estate, they built very expensive apartments and condominiums right next to the park. And that prevented people, the community that used to be living there, to be able to continue affording that space. And then new residents also started calling police on the drum circle. And so that whole drum circle tradition in Marcus Garvey Park was totally displaced because of, and that whole community was displaced because of this contradictory process that we see taking place between exchange value and use value. And again, these are all concepts I'm arguing that political ecology can use in conjunction with urban ecology. We can get these disciplines talking to each other for a more robust and a fuller understanding of what's going on with our urban ecosystems. And so again, I want to look at this satellite image of Detroit where I did my master's research, just to see, again, that patchwork of Detroit's a very stark example of that patchwork of invested versus disinvested neighborhoods. You can see down here, this is downtown Detroit, and here's midtown Detroit. These are the parts of Detroit where there is a huge resurgence in capital, a huge resurgence in exchange value. Property values are rising, new things are getting built. It's actually cool to see some life coming back into Detroit. I really love Detroit as a city, and I love hanging out in some of those neighborhoods, like cool coffee shops and bars popping up all over the place, urban agriculture. But not far away, we can see some of these areas where they look like these green blotches from space, but these are areas that have been so abandoned that the houses are rotting away. They're being bulldozed and basically just converted into urban prairie, which again, that introduces some opportunities for urban ecosystems, and we can maybe manage that in a really good way for both the human communities and for the urban ecosystems. But as it stands, it's just this very stark patchwork of both invested and disinvested neighborhoods. So ultimately, again, I'm arguing political ecology enhances our understanding of pollinator biodiversity in cities. So what I'm going to be doing as I continue working on my dissertation, I'm going to be using some of the technical methodologies I've been learning as a geographer, including remote sensing and geographic information systems. Remote sensing is typically done with satellite or aircrafts. It detects and monitors the physical characteristics of the landscape using emitted radiation. In my case, and when I say the word radiation, I'm just talking light waves in a lot of cases, but that can be beyond the visual. That can be like ultraviolet, and in some cases LiDAR too, where there's like an active laser that gets reflected back to the craft, and that gives you a lot of information of the shape of the landscape and what's going on. I use Landsat satellite, which is very useful, especially if you want to look at stuff beyond just the visual, because, plants include, you can get a lot of information from plant communities looking at them from space when you go beyond just the visual. And Landsat is a specific satellite that provides it provides ultraviolet, it provides infrared, spectral information of plant communities that includes in cities too. So I can use that to my advantage. In fact, right here, I've been playing with some of that imagery. On the left is Landsat imagery of Philadelphia. This is infrared. And on the right is Montreal, another city I'm going to be looking at later in my dissertation. And you can see when we look at these cities from the infrared, we can see there's a much starker contrast between the impervious surfaces that we see in the core of the city versus the more vegetated areas. Right here where my cursor is, this is Fairmount Park, this red blotch right here. So this just provides a really nice, useful form of analysis. And here, it's really pretty. This is a way that I've transformed the satellite image, the Landsat satellite image, drawing out some of the spectral dynamics in order to make even more contrast between the impervious surfaces and the vegetated surfaces. So in this case, the red is the impervious. You can see how red South Philly is down here, and Port Richmond up here, northeast Philly. And then here, like the blue, the light blue aqua, that is the vegetated coverage. And so again, this is Fairmount Park right here, and here's the main line. So yeah, you can just get a lot of information, and then you can quantify these pixels and do all kinds of cool statistical stuff with this information. So this is one methodology I'm using going forward. I'm also using more geographic information systems. Right now, I'm working on figuring out where I'm going to be sampling my bees in Philadelphia. And here's just an example of a map of the census tracts of Philly. Right now, I'm trying to get together all of the census data and attach that census data to these census tracts, and then figure out where the more invested versus more disinvested areas are, so that I can kind of compare the pockets of investment versus the pockets of disinvestment, so I can attach the theoretical stuff that I was talking about to some of the on-the-ground data that I'm going to be going out and sampling. And so ultimately, I'm going to be sampling more bees, taking them back to the lab, and hopefully I'll find some cool, interesting stuff as I'm combining these two disciplines, urban political ecology and urban ecology. So we'll see. That's where I'm at. And I would like to leave, well, we've got some time for Q&A, but first I want to just mention these people that have really guided me, these mentors. Yvette Perfecto, my master's advisor at Michigan. She's excellent. She focuses on agroecology, but also urban bees. Rebecca Tonietto, I mentioned her earlier. She's currently teaching at the University of Michigan Flint. She does a lot of cool urban bee stuff. This is my current master's advisor, geographer Hamel Pearsall. She focuses on green spaces in cities. And Doug Sponsler, I talked about his study in Philadelphia earlier. He's on my committee, and he's been super helpful as well. So I want to leave the remaining time for questions. And I also want to remind people that my email right here, aumartin@temple.edu, is open for people to reach out to if you want to talk further about this stuff or you have questions or whatever. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Austin. So if you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, we can come back together. Great.
I know that was a lot. That was a huge overview. So anyone who's really interested in this stuff, maybe look over this again later too, and if you really want.
Most definitely. Yeah. All right. So some of the questions came in as you were talking. So I think we probably have to rewind back to the very beginning. So this was when you were talking about varroa mites. It says several years ago, I read about Purdue University breeding honeybees that would clean off and attack the varroa mite off each other. Are you familiar with this research, and were they successful in developing this bee? I guess if you're familiar with the research.
Yeah, I am familiar, and you know, they were successful to a degree, and that's among beekeepers. That Purdue genetic line is commonly known. It's high premium for those queens, and so beekeepers who really want those hygienic, they're called hygienic queens because of they have that sort of behavior of cleaning mites off of each other. You know, it's expensive to get those queens, but it can be worth it. Now, it hasn't solved the overall mite problem which continues, but it has helped the problem.
Okay, great. So this is when you were talking about kind of like grass oasis, right? Or desert, excuse me, and thinking about how we might be able to make that into an oasis. Someone was asking if you want part of your property to be good for walking and playing on, what would you suggest using instead of grass? Not sure if that's your forte, but.
Yeah, well, and I live in Philadelphia. I don't actually have a lawn of my own that I maintain, but I do think about this stuff a lot. And I don't know, I've seen cool ways people deal with this, like where they have some turf grass areas in their lawn, but they just reduce the area of turf grass, and they have the rest as like brushy areas that maybe they put like nice looking rocks around the borders to make it look intentional, but it's, you know, unkempt brush, which is good nesting for native bees, or, you know, dead wood, which is also great nesting for native bees, bare patches of soil. So there are things you can do to make it look nice and intentional, and then also maybe keep a little bit of turf grass just for playing, because, you know, there is nice value in having at least a little bit for playing and running around on. And also, I suggest mowing, like staggering your mowing, like mow one section one week and then another section another week. Because having that, it really makes a difference for bees. If you mow it all at once, it sets them back. But if you do it in sections, it helps them out a lot.
Okay. Someone chimed in here and said that there are blends of low-growing clovers which require only cutting twice a season. They grow about 6 inches tall. And I know there's a lot of different native sedges and things that you can grow. I'm just not sure if you're really, you know, running and tough on them, how well those types of plants would hold up. But thank you for that comment about the clover. All right. So this goes back to when you were talking about some of the different chemicals that are used. This question is, when we buy plants from local nurseries, are they most likely treated with chemicals so that bees can't benefit from them?
I mean, yeah, in some cases, depending on where you're getting them, they are, especially more so at the big box stores. But I think in many cases, if the local nursery, what I've seen, especially if they're like focused on native plants, they're often more careful with that. But as far as general rules, I don't know of any general rules other than that sort of overview.
Right. And just sharing, you know, Jenkins is a spot that does, you know, grow a lot of our plants, and we're very aware of that. And it is not something that we're using on our own plants that we are selling. And I believe when we buy in things from other wholesale nurseries, we're also asking a lot of questions and being aware of that. So I think that is something to definitely be aware of and keep in mind when you are choosing where you're purchasing your plants for your gardens.
Yeah, I've actually purchased native plants from Jenkins. It's a cool spot.
Yeah, awesome. This is talking a little bit about mulching practices and for ground nesting bees. So it says, I used to mulch my flower gardens with wood mulch, but since have changed to leaf matter. They rake leaves and use their neighbors' raked leaves to mulch the beds. Will ground nesting bees be able to get through the leaves, or do they need bare ground?
There are some ground nesting species that do need bare soil. So, I mean, yeah, I encourage, leaf litter is great for a lot of species, including non-bee species. But if you really want to have the full spectrum of bee diversity, if you really want to encourage that, do make some bare patches of soil.
Okay, great. This one starts with excellent talk
Thank you.
In the study, you mentioned earlier on the attraction of urban non-native plants to bees. Was bee biodiversity, like native versus European honeybees, studied as well?
In that particular study that Doug Sponsler did with his team, they were only looking at honeybees. They were taking pollen samples and looking at the DNA of the pollen to identify the plants out there. But they so honeybees are more generalist as pollinators than a lot of native bee species. So there it could be that some native bee species in the city are still like mostly sticking to native plants that they're pollinating. But there also are some native bee species that are in the generalist direction. And so in some cases, we can surmise they probably are mimicking or mirroring what Doug saw with the honeybees there in terms of really relying on some of those non-native exotic woody plants.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That was actually a note that I wrote down too, about the non-native bees. Like, were they attracted to non-native plants because of both of them being non-native? But it sounds like you're saying that honeybees are more generalists.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. All right, let me check the chats real quick. Let's see if there's any other questions out there. Just a lot of great feedback for you, Austin. And thank you for being with us tonight. And so those of you who are still out there with us, just to share, Austin has given me a nice list of resources to share for you all. So I will put that together and share that when I share the recording. And I'll also add the information about that gentleman who takes the really cool bee photos. I'll include that in as well. So, and hopefully some of you can join us next month in July, on July 20th. Our topic will be moth ecology and conservation, and how that actually falls in line with National Moth Week. So we had Austin here tonight as kind of our prelude to National Pollinator Week. And then in July, we get National Moth Week. So how much fun to be able to talk about insects back to back. So Austin, thanks again for being with us, and good luck with all of your research. And maybe we'll get you back at some point to give us an update on where you're at.
Awesome. Well, thanks,
Awesome.
Amy, again. And I really appreciate everybody's feedback and questions. And yeah, again, please reach out. My email, I have it in the talk, aumartin@temple.edu. I'd love to keep the conversation going with anyone who wants to.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being available. All right. All right. Good night, everybody. Thanks again.
Good night.
Bye.